joining us this evening at our event. We're very privileged to have some guests who have driven in, I'm sure, challenging traffic situations coming from Toronto. Our evening tonight is entitled Social Enterprise, the Signal, Not the Noise. And we'll get to our three speakers to present, and then we'll do a question and answer afterwards. My name is Bruce McAdams. I am a professor here at the Hospitality School, and I will be keeping the evening moving tonight, and then introducing the panel. So you're not here to hear me speak, so I'll introduce, first of all, our first speaker and the inspiration for this event when I came to Petra and asked her to speak to a class of undergraduates for myself, and we realized we couldn't make that happen. So we're like, we'll open it up and do a public talk and expand it to bring in some other expertise. So let me introduce Petra. Petra Kassun-Mutch is our, first and foremost for me, is our CME entrepreneur in residence this semester. So we're very fortunate to have her here. After 18 years in the publishing industry, Petra decided to leave her corporate career and pursue her dream of starting a social purpose enterprise in a rural community. Picton, I guess you would actually call it Picton proper, Fifth Town Cheese, which I had the pleasure of enjoying the cheese and also visiting a few years ago. After leaving Fifth Town in 2011, Petra decided to deepen her commitment to building a vibrant social enterprise sector in Ontario and launched her newest social enterprise advocacy venture called Zugenrud. Did I pronounce that correctly? And as I mentioned before, also accepted the position of entrepreneur in residence at the University of Guelph. I'm going to let you, please come in. Yeah. I'm going to let you take it from here, and we'll then proceed to the other speakers. So welcome.
So thanks everyone for coming out this evening to learn a little bit more about social enterprise. One of the things we wanted to start off this section with is really understanding what social enterprise is all about. Because there's a lot of confusion out in the marketplace and amongst a lot of different players. In fact, there's a lot of confusion around the definition of social enterprise. You hear a lot of terminology: social innovation, social entrepreneurs, social finance, corporate social responsibility, social this and social that. It almost sounds a little bit like what we used to do with the word green and put it in front of almost everything that was out there. So what I want to try to do is cut through some of that and really get down to what a social enterprise actually is. And that's what I'm going to start to do, and then my two colleagues are going to expand a little bit on specific areas of social enterprise, one being social finance, and the other one being what is the Ontario government doing about this opportunity in the next several years. So as I say this evening, what we're going to talk about is what is a social enterprise. By the way, let me ask, has anyone here actually attended the social enterprise session before? Okay, you have. So we're going to talk about what is a social enterprise, where did the idea initially come from, why now, because it's a fairly new idea, what today's social enterprise landscape looks like, why we need a new legal social enterprise form, that's a little bit of editorializing and advocacy on my part, and where to next. So, what is a social enterprise? So let me ask the question, since we have an audience here. I'm going to ask you to tell me what you think is social enterprise. What are some of the characteristics of a social enterprise based on what you know? Come on. Okay.
It's got a social benefit.
It's got a social benefit to it. Okay. Another one.
I think it takes into account externalities beyond profit.
Okay. It goes beyond profit. What else? Anybody else? Yes?
So business creates positive change.
A business that creates positive change. All right. What else? Anything else? The gentleman in the back who's taken courses before, or programs.
Well, Canada Revenue Agency has come up with a working definition.
Okay.
And to put it very simply, think of a business that, in terms of its operations, has both clearly stated social goals and financial goals. Financial goals include profitability.
Okay, good, thank you. And yourself?
Just thinking that it blurs the lines between what we traditionally think of as a charity or not-for-profit and a for-profit enterprise, and trying to group that both.
Kind of in the middle, a hybrid of sorts. Okay, so you've been reading the material out there. You've read about it in the news. Let's take a look at a couple of examples, and I'm going to ask you if you think these are social enterprises. So when you type in social enterprise into Google, and Social Enterprise Canada, this is what you get. Is anyone familiar with Social Enterprise for Canada? Okay, so what they actually are is a not-for-profit registered charity that develops and manages a number of benevolent and social purpose services, which include family, youth, and children's services, newcomer services, newcomer to Canada, and strategic consulting services. They used to be known as the York Region Neighborhood Services. So that's what you get when you type in social enterprise. They've been around for quite some time. And the interesting thing about this, and I'm going to show you a couple more examples, is they started using the term social enterprise for Canada before the term became something more than what it was at the time. So that's what you get when you type in social enterprise for Canada. And those are the services that they provide, and they are a charity. Okay, what about this company? Everybody knows Ben & Jerry's. Are they a social enterprise? Now, we know they were founded in around 1978 in Burlington, Vermont, and by two guys who met in a gym class. And at that point, nobody was talking about social enterprise or sustainability, as far as I can remember. I'm not old enough to be entirely remembering at 1978 what was being talked about in that space, but I doubt it was social enterprise. And it was celebrated for many years as an example of how business can be a force for positive social change, even before all this dialogue started. They started with $12,000 in their pocket. Today, depending on what article you read and when you read it, estimated to be between $250 and $500 million. It's now owned by Unilever, and it's just about to become, or has just become, another B Corp, a certified B Corporation, which is kind of interesting because it's owned by a parent company. They established foundations, and at the time they did something that was pretty unheard of for an enterprise like that, is they provided 7.5% of their profits, of their annual pre-tax profits, to local community organizations. What about this group? I doubt you know this group, but I had to put in an international example. So this is an interesting group, the Balbo group. They are actually based in Santo Antonio and Sao Francisco, and they basically make plastic out of sugar cane. And they've recently renamed themselves the Native Organic Products Group, which when I first heard about them, I thought it was organic foods, but it's basically plastic made out of sugar. And they just won the Social Venture Network award in 2011 for their social enterprise activities. Their website isn't particularly flamboyant, but it's a joint venture, and the reason they won is they go beyond legislation offering preventative and emergency health care, dental assistance, and scholarship for, among other benefits for their employees. So that's what their main social innovation is. This one, Mountain Equipment Co-op, anybody shop there? Really expensive camping gears for people who only go camping a few times a year. That's why I shop there anyway. It's supposed to make camping more comfortable. It's a co-op, retail co-op, and so as such, it's a slightly different type of organization. Its mission is to inspire and enable everyone to lead active outdoor lifestyles. And they do that by selling outdoor gear, clothing, and services. They match their members with gear that suits their needs, but they offer more than products. They offer passion, and we love to share our expertise, experience, and enthusiasm. That's their mission statement. And they are a little different because they are a co-op. You have to be a member in order to shop there. A membership used to cost about $5. I'm not sure if it's about the same. And as a member, according to their bylaws, you can vote at annual meetings, but they do have a tiered voting structure. So you are allowed to participate and vote, and actually you can stand as director for their board, but there is a nominating process. I don't remember how many members they have, but I'm going to guess it's close to 1 million members or so. This next one, is this a social enterprise? Those of you in Toronto maybe have heard of this before. I don't know if Ryan has. Tiffin Day. So this is a young lady, a new entrepreneur who started Tiffin Day, and what she basically does is hires disadvantaged new immigrant women to prepare vegan meals in something called tiffins, which are reusable. They're basically tin lunch boxes, and delivers them to Bay Street, the downtown core, for lunch. And lastly, this is ZooShare. It is a non-profit renewable energy cooperative, which basically turns zoo poo into biogas. Their slogan is, they have a button called "I poop for the zoo." They do well with the whole notion of that. The fact is, only about 20% of their energy will come from zoo poo, in particular because they're losing their elephants, and the rest of it will probably come from llamas as food waste. But the idea is that they will be powering the zoo in return for use of the land. It's a community power project. It is a co-op. You can buy a share for $100. You can also invest in it. There's 3 levels of investment tranches, and they're looking to raise a couple $1 million. They haven't actually built the facility yet. So what is a social enterprise? I put those up there and then asked the question, are these social enterprises? And when I asked you the question, what is a social enterprise, you basically came up with these kinds of characteristics. There's a social purpose or a social mission to it. It generally generates revenues to achieve that. It can be for-profit or not-for-profit. It can also be a co-op, and supposed to create stakeholder value, not just shareholder value. But is that it? And what I want to kind of venture into further is sort of develop the idea that there's a lot more to it than that. And one of the problems we have in terms of looking at the social enterprise space as a field or as a continuum is, I think that it obscures the opportunity to make a social enterprise a real opportunity to use the power of business to change the world for a better place. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So first we're going to take a step back. And one of the reasons that there are so many definitions of social enterprise and why the continuum exists, there's not-for-profits who have revenue-generating entities off to the side. Then there's for-profits who are doing good social things but are not necessarily a social enterprise. They may just be really strong corporate social responsibility-oriented companies. And one of the reasons you see all these different definitions is the different approaches to understanding social enterprise. So some take the approach that any organization that balances social and economic goals is a social enterprise. Kind of like saying any organization that balances environmental and economic goals is a green enterprise. Develop social capital, can be a hybrid. The purpose of the project or activity might be an approach to understanding which one of these things is a social enterprise. And on from there. So in order to understand what I would argue is sort of the crux of the social enterprise space, we have to turn back a little bit to understand where the idea came from. I'm going to posit that basically that a social enterprise is a mission-first, financially sustainable organization that can effectively attract capital and harness the power of market-based solutions to affect positive social and environmental change. That's a real mouthful, and one of the things we have to focus on in particular is a sustainable organization. It means a company that can last, not just economically, but through the different cycles of what businesses tend to go through, including startup, second stage funding, growth, and then eventually perhaps even the sale or transfer of a business over time. All right, going back to where the idea came from, over the last 4 or 5 decades, there are a number of things that have happened, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. It's kind of a movement over the last 50 years where all of a sudden this all came down in a funnel to talk about social enterprise, which I think the language was first really came about in around 2005, 2006 is when we first started hearing about it. All right, so a little history bit. Does everyone know who this is? Of course it says who this is. Milton Friedman, who wrote a paper, a New York Times article in 1970, and of course his famous quote is, "There's one and only one social responsibility in business, and that's to use resources and engage in activities designed to increase profits, so long as it engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud." And he wrote that in 1970, and everybody likes to point a finger at Milton Friedman. And many also point out that his comments were taken out of context. But it did resonate with people, which is why 30, 40 years later, we're still looking back at it. And you have to kind of look at what was going on in the 70s at the time when he said this, or wrote about this. Regulations were growing. There was a sense that managers and CEOs were frittering away money on initiatives that served their ego and not necessarily the shareholders. And there was also a lot of other things going on in those times, and I'm just going to jump ahead to that. Does anyone remember the 70s, other than me? Okay, well, okay, George. Remember long gas lines? Everybody's worried about the price of oil. There's going to be an oil shortage. Everybody was hoarding things. The other thing that was happening in the 70s was high unemployment and soaring prices. There was the advent of inflation. In 1969, in that period, it was about, in the U.S. alone, it was 80 million people who were out of work. Funny enough, I had to put this in there, is that some of the literature blamed the women's empowerment movement because all of a sudden women came into the workforce in a big way in the 70s, and the Vietnam vets came home from Vietnam. And apart from the fact that the economy was shrinking, you also had this sudden growth in the numbers of people wanting to look for work. In Canada, there was the October crisis in 1970, and wage and price controls, and on it went. So it wasn't a particularly happy time. And companies were having a difficult time as well, and shareholders were having a difficult time. They weren't happy with what they were getting. So you can kind of understand why this ethos might have taken root. So then the next period is the 1980s. Everybody remembers these two guys. Did they sing Irish Eyes Were Smiling or something like that together at some point in time? They did. So things in the things got a lot worse before they got better. There was another severe recession in the early 80s. There was crazy inflation. I am old enough to remember what my house mortgage was at, and it was 14.5% in those days. High unemployment still. This time the reason for it was not women, but the baby boom. Government spending and policies that worked before were not working. And despair during this time led to a new movement, the general adoption of neoliberal economic policies throughout the 80s and in many parts of the world. And it became sort of the new ethos of the day. Slowly, new monetary policy took place, deregulation, and things started to turn around. And then inflation fell from 13.5% to 3.2% by 1983. Jobs started to come back. Stock market took off, and everybody remembers him. And this is Gordon Gekko. And this movie, I think, encapsulates the zeitgeist of the time. And two of his famous quotes from the movie, which I'll read one of them, one's longer and the other one's shorter. Basically, he tells his young co-star, "The richest 1% of this country owns half our country's wealth, $5 trillion. 1/3 of that comes from hard work. 2/3 come from inheritance, interest on interest accumulating to widows and idiot sons, and what I do, stock and real estate speculation." We have an adult. He says it's bullshit. You've got 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth. I create nothing. I own. We make the rules, pal. The news, the wars, the peace, famine, upheaval, the price per paperclip. We pick the rabbit out of the hat while everybody else sits out there wondering how the hell we did it. Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's a free market, and you're a part of it. you've got that killer instinct, stick around, I've got a lot to teach you. And that was one of the famous quotes. And the other one was, lunch is for wimps. So fast forward from that period to the late 1990s and 2000s. So we've had this period of growth and wealth accumulation and wealth concentration. And of course, you recognize most of these characters. And all of a sudden, there was trouble brewing. I mean, really, Martha Stewart got arrested. And you recognize Bernie Madoff, our very own Conrad Black, Ken Lay, and of course, Lehman Brothers. And then by the early 2000s, things started to change. The moods changed a little bit more. All of a sudden, we weren't applauding all this wealth and accumulation and basically shareholder values, everything. And I worked in a corporate environment in those days, and I sat in the boardroom while we debated how to spend our money and whether or not whether or not it would improve shareholder value. And we used to evaluate projects on the basis of what effect it would have on shareholder value. So that was very much what we did in the time, and I did an MBA in those days too, and that's what we talked about. We certainly were talking about environmental or social responsibility back in those days. So now we've got this shift, and Aaron Brockovich comes around, and suddenly we start wondering whether corporations are evil or whether they're doing things that are not so good. In this case, meantime, we have social media happening, and I don't need to tell this audience around what kind of impact these have on transparency and enabling small groups to form and getting ideas out there. Then we went on to hear from Al Gore, who some would argue he single-handedly put climate change and the green agenda on the map for the majority of people, whether you liked him or didn't like him. He certainly played that type of a role. He had Hurricane Katrina and environmental issues started to really play high on most agendas. We heard about income gaps starting to happen. Not that they were just starting to happen, but it was hitting the news a little bit more. We heard about the bottom billion and 4 billion people living on $1 a day. We heard about the increase in government debts. And then 2008 hit, and we had the financial crisis and credit dried up. And then we had Occupy Wall Street, and the sudden response to all of this was, not only should we be careful about, should we be wary of corporations, and we've lost trust in them, less had consumer surveys basically demonstrated that people had less trust in corporations than they've ever had. And on top of that, now they were questioning the system itself. So that's sort of up until 2008. Now roll it back a little, 1 or 2 years before that. I'm just going to go one more step. And one social observation, everybody remembers this movie. In the past, movies in the 40s and 50s had gangsters as sort of the bad guys. And probably during the Cold War, you remember the Hunt for Red October, the bad guys were the communists. And then a little bit later on, we had we weren't fighting communists anymore, we were fighting alien nations and bad guys in outer space. And now, if this is sort of the harbinger of where popular culture was thinking at the time, Avatar made corporations the bad guys, wiping out whole societies and wiping out the environment at the same time. So, this is the environment in which social enterprise was born. And it's not, I think it's important to think about it that way, because that's why when some organizations been around for 50, 60 or longer years will say, well, we've always been a social enterprise. We've always been a double or triple bottom line organization, especially not for profits in that space. And some companies, like Ben & Jerry's, who've always said, well, we've always been a type of social enterprise. I'm going to argue and say that we're in a different space now because of all the reasons I've just described. Corporations are not well trusted. There's a lot of big issues in the world to solve. There's not a lot of money because government debt is soaking up a lot of that money. And there's a need for something to change. And people have pointed to social and they also would argue that business has to be part of that change. I'm going to go further and suggest that corporate social responsibility and how it has moved forward is not enough because people still don't trust some of the corporations. So what happens when old things are discredited, people want to come up with new things that can come up with the middle that they can hang their hat on. And I think that's what social enterprise has become. And in general, if we look at sort of where capitalism has come in, and actually I'm going to go back one more second here, and say that people started to look at business as how can we, if governments don't have money and not-for-profits, the not-for-profit sector is doing everything it can, but it doesn't have enough money, it's going to get even less money. And by the way, it's only 7% or 6% of GDP, depending on what country you're in. How are we going to solve these big problems that require collaboration across sectors, across countries, and so on? And they're basically suggesting that businesses, harnessing the power of business to do this may be one of the only ways to turn the boat around. And how do we do that? I almost call social enterprise, that whole idea, a bit of a movement, I guess I would call it, in that space. And we've been, it's not the first time that the private sector has experienced change as a result of the movement. So the last time that happened was in this type of world about 100, 150 years ago when co-ops came into being. So there were no co-ops at one point in time. And the co-ops, a movement in the States and the Anarchist movement in Canada, and the idea is mostly rural, and the idea was to find a way to concentrate, to sort of, the concern at the time was just post-Vanderbilt industrialist type of time, and the concern was how do we take back ownership of capital, and how do we take back power, and how do we run things for ourselves, and that can benefit everybody in the community. And the idea of a co-op was born. And co-ops are a legal and different legal entity form that you can choose to become if you're starting a business. And the key distinguishing feature of a co-op is, of course, one member, one vote. So the idea is that it was very democratic, and it really took off in rural areas and in particular sectors. And right now, I'll mention a couple of statistics around it. The legacy of co-ops, and I'm kind of looking at this saying that if co-ops were sort of the private sector response to issues, social issues 100, 150 years ago, what would social enterprise look like in 100, 150 years from now? And would we be having similar types of statistics? So co-op by the numbers, this is Ontario. In Canada, there's over 9,000, but there's 1,300 independent co-ops operating. These are the areas in which they tend to operate. You know, some of them are the larger ones, Desjardins, Van City, and so on. And this is where they represent about $35.7 billion, and most of them are in agriculture, and the next big chunk is in retail and wholesale as well. So co-ops as a new legal form in the private sector space did extremely well and grew and thrived. Now, is it the form for everybody? No. And even though you have some organizations that run their organizations very democratically, they're still not considered a co-op. And co-ops have very specific bylaws and articles in their incorporation that require them to run and report in a certain way. So, is the co-op movement, is social enterprise today like the co-op movement was back in about 100 years ago? So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the spectrum approach to looking at social enterprise. And this is sort of the opportunity that people have observed. You have traditional business, you've got grant-funded not-for-profits and charities, and then you have revenue-generating not-for-profits over here. And then basically, some people have said, well, there's a gap, there's an opportunity to put something between revenue-generating not-for-profits and between traditional business. The way I kind of look at it is the social part of the spectrum is looking for more enterprise in their lives, and the enterprise side of the spectrum is looking for more social in their lives. So they're sort of coming a bit together. The Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, I'll just show you a couple of different perspectives on how people look at this spectrum. This is how they see it. Government and quasi-governmental organizations, nonprofits and charities have got public benefit at heart. When they see for-profit business over here, for private benefit, there's public benefit, and then social purpose business and social enterprise somewhere in the middle between the not-for-profits and the for-profit. This one I know Ryan's going to recognize, I think. Actually, it comes from Helen's deck, but this is another way of looking at how social enterprises fit into a spectrum. So you've got traditional business on one end, grant-funded not-for-profits and charities on the other end, and then revenue-generating not-for-profits, which means not-for-profits who may have, for example, the ballet has a store in Yorkville, and you can buy things there, and the money goes towards the ballet. That would be an example of a revenue-generating not-for-profit. And then you've got social ventures in the middle, and social purpose business sort of straddling halfway through there. But the idea is that there's space for something new that doesn't fit into those other definitions. We have a few examples there. Some people, some researchers have looked at that spectrum and basically argued that what they see happening over time is that everybody's moving towards the middle. Not-for-profits will have far more enterprise in their world, and the for-profits will have far more social in the world, and that everybody's going to be a hybrid in the middle. I'm not, that would be great, and I think that would be true on a values basis, but I'm not sure that's going to be true on an organizational design basis, or nor should it be, and I'll explain why that should be. So, back to this slide here, it's not enough to think about social enterprise as a values-based, that the values that an organization subscribes to is the basis for a description as a social enterprise. It requires much, much more than that. And I sort of feel like I know a little bit about that because I tried to run one. And I know what it's like to run a social enterprise in the absence of legal endorsement, and in the absence of a lot of the support structures that surround the not-for-profit side of the industry and the for-profit side of the industry. I can tell you that the will to do it and the desire to do it gets you so far, but it doesn't allow you to necessarily transcend all the different phases that any business would necessarily go through, including exit and selling your business and preserving the mission once you get to that stage. And that's where I think we're missing a little bit of the vote, is we need to do what we did with co-ops, and that is make it a legal form so it has some legs to stand on. So why the new organizational form? Well, on a softer level, it will engender public trust. I think a lot of people still distrust traditional organizations, even if they're moving in the right direction, putting the right checks and balances in place. So if you have a social enterprise and you're buying their stuff because they said they were a social enterprise, how do you really know? And what, where is the money going? How is it distributed? Et cetera, et cetera. And then how does that social enterprise compete for, and I know Katie will talk a little bit about this, and attract capital to that type of enterprise? What's going to make an investor choose a social enterprise that may get some returns, no returns? Some will argue a social enterprise should have as good of a return as any other commercial enterprise. But the fact is, a lot of social enterprises are doing very innovative new things, and just like other companies who do innovative new things, the risk factor is a lot higher. So that's why, it allows government to stimulate social enterprises specifically through policy initiatives and incentives, such as favorable tax treatment, and I'll talk about that in a moment. That's not a popular idea. Offering clarity on limits of activities for investors is really important for investors when they're investing in the company to understand what the limits are and the legal limits are, and not invent them along the way when things hit as an organization grows and develops. The capacity of private sector business now practicing more than corporate social responsibility further distinguish themselves from their competition as authentic multiple bottom line businesses, because it is harder to succeed in that space. So going back to definition of social enterprise, we've talked a little bit about these things already. But I want to talk about what else should go into the definition of a real social and authentic social enterprise. So yes, the mission has to be part of the articles of incorporation and the mandate and bylaws. Stakeholder interests should be mentioned. Distribution of income or surpluses should be defined. What do people do? What happens to the profits or the surpluses? How are they? Do they go back to the investors entirely? Is a certain percentage of it required to go back into the community or back into the company? How is that defined? Percent of net profits assigned to the community. Asset locks. Does anyone know what an asset lock is? Okay, so let's say you invest, or you are part of it, you've got a community, a social enterprise in your community, and they own a building, and they have a shelter in that building. And let's say over 30 years that the land in the building that they acquired for a very little bit of money at the time, because maybe it wasn't very well developed, suddenly now is worth a lot of money because there's been a lot of development in and around it. So if you're a director on that board, and I'm going to stretch this match and say your job is to make sure that you maximize returns, then you would look at the value of that building and say, well, we bought it for $1 million and now it's worth $30 million. Maybe we should just sell this. And we could take that money, we could put some of it back into what we do with a social mission, and we could distribute the rest to our investors and our shareholders. So what asset locks tend to do is they tend to restrict the sale of the assets of the enterprise to usually other charitable or other community-based enterprises. So they can't be sold for just the purpose of profit. Mission preservation and sale and transfer, how is that articulated? Third-party audits, who says that they're doing, that they're achieving what the outcomes they're hoping to do? Filing reports, what kind of reports do they have to file? What level of transparency are they required to adhere to? And what is the tax treatment? So with this in mind, there have been new organizational forms, also in Italy and other places around the world. I just concentrated on these three before. So with this in mind, what other countries have done, and only BC and Canada in May of this year has done the same. So Canada has its first new legal entity called a community contribution company. Company or corporation? I think it's company, right? Corporation. Community Contribution Corporation. And I'll talk about that one in a second. But the first one that came around was in the UK in 2005, and this is what I mentioned, this is all fairly new. There are now 3,500 of them operating as of 2010, probably more since it's 2012. Key features, they can attract investment, they must meet a community interest test, they cannot be a charity, and they do have an asset lock feature. They get no favorable tax treatment, they can be public or private companies, and they do pay dividends to investors, but they are capped. So that's how those are structured. Benefit corporation in the U.S., you'll hear a lot about B Corps, and I'll actually pass this around. B corporations are actually just certifications. It's not actually a legal form, but that's their 2012 annual report. There are 58 of them in Canada now. But basically there's 519, there's one in Australia, and they're also starting to penetrate in the UK. But that's the certification. Now I'm going to talk about the legal side. So there are now 7 states, and I believe it might actually be a bit higher, but that was the last statistic we read, who have put into place a benefit corporation option. It's different from an L3C. I know I'm getting very legal on you, but it's important because these are the things, I think this is the part of the DNA that makes up a true social enterprise. So again, it's allowed to attract investment, and it has to change the articles of incorporation to recognize stakeholders, which is a big deal in the US because directors can be liable for not taking a profit maximization point of view. There's different reporting structures, and in some states they've required them to give up to 5% to charity. Favorable tax treatment, no. Public-private, yes, and they can pay dividends, and they may or may not be capped, depending on the state. L3Cs is another option. It's only been adopted by 9 states in the U.S. It's really it's a little bit different. It's more about creating a hybrid entity that enables foundations to spend the 5% that they're supposed to spend on projects. So I believe they're called, I can't remember what PIR stands for at the moment, but anyways, it's eligible, L3Cs are eligible for foundation funding. So that takes, and foundation funding is huge in the U.S. and allows foundations to invest in L3Cs and understand that they will be meeting their obligations. Favorable tax treatment, no. Public, private, yes. Pays dividends, yes. So over to the first one in Canada that became legal in May of 2012. There are none yet that I know of. And basically, it's very community-centered. And the goal of the enterprise has to be to assist communities with social issues. They must devote a portion of profits to the community as percentage, and they do have an asset lock. Favorable tax treatment, no. Public and private, yes. And it does pay dividends, but it's also capped. So that's the first one. So I'm hoping Ryan can tell us what's going to happen in Ontario now that we've seen what happens in BC. BC is a little bit ahead of the game on this. I mentioned B Corp certification. You'll see it in the news. I just want to make the point that it's a certification, like LEED certification is. It certifies companies that have a triple bottom line, if you want to say that. And I'm just going to close off with, since we've talked about what a social enterprise is, and the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot more to it than just the mission portion of it. I think we have to look at some of these other aspects, like transfers and where did the profits go, and so on and so forth. The other aspects are what about social entrepreneurs, and you'll read a lot about social entrepreneurs and social innovation and that kind of thing. And I found in the literature, as the entrepreneur in residence here, that a lot of the stuff is the same as any entrepreneur. The only two things that I think are different for a social entrepreneur is the higher tolerance for risk and failure, because you're innovating in a different way, and you're also innovating in a space that's not well understood or not necessarily well supported just yet. And you're also dealing with, when you deal with failure, you're not dealing with just a community with a business failure, you're dealing with an entire community that has repercussions as a result of your failure. And then the understanding that the efforts will not likely generate personal wealth. Most of the students I come across who want to be entrepreneurs are not becoming entrepreneurs because they want to be poor for the rest of their lives. They're looking at it as a way of earning a living. And I'm suggesting here that when you get into this space, you're choosing that it's not likely to generate great personal wealth. And the third thing is ability to secure capital investment. Now, I may be wrong about that personal wealth side, but I'm going to guess not. A couple of comments about where the gaps are in the support ecology. The dark greens are the areas that I think are actually fairly well developed and understood. The lighter greens are the ones that are not so well developed and understood. So government policy is kind of in between. I think county principles haven't really come a long way yet. Legal side hasn't. And even on the education side, I put that a little bit on the lighter side because there hasn't been enough research done in this space to help people understand what it takes to be successful and what the area needs. Ooh, okay then. That wasn't supposed to happen. But this was more or less a summary of what we've just said. And the idea behind this is basically that these are some of the recommendations around what needs to happen next in the financial services, the legal side, and the government side. Essentially, what we're looking for is something that can define what a social enterprise is by building it in right into the DNA of the company, which includes its articles of incorporation and its bylaws, how it operates, not just the purpose and the will, the social outcomes that the entrepreneurs and the people involved actually want to undertake. It's not enough. It won't survive the stages. So that's all I have to say about the social enterprise space. And I will now, I do mention here the rest of Canada has to get going. We're known to be about 10 years behind in this space compared to other jurisdictions, and we kind of need to get going. We were successful with co-ops, and we should be successful with introducing social enterprise as a distinct sector within our private sector. So that's about it, and I guess I'll turn it over to.
Excellent. And we'll save questions for the